So this morning we read in the book of Genesis the story of God calling forth Abraham to sacrifice his only son, whom God had given to him in the first place. And some of y'all may already know this, but I feel like I need to confess it once again. I have always hated this story. Really. It never sat right with me. It never sat right with me that God would call Abraham to sacrifice his son after Abraham had prayed and waited patiently for 25 years for his wife, who was also right around 100 years old at the time, to conceive and give birth, for such a miracle to happen. And then a few years later, God turns around and says, nope, I want him back. But I am grateful that, as with all things, the more you know, the more you understand, the more you read, the more you learn. And I was so relieved to learn what I learned in doing research for this sermon, because I got to tell you what, y'all, other than saying I hate this and it makes no sense to me. So at the time of this story, Abraham was living amongst different tribal people in the land of Canaan. He had followed God's voice out into the wilderness, and that lasted for about 25 years. And then Isaac, the miracle of Isaac, came along, and Isaac was born, and Isaac was 10 to 14 years old at this time. And so Abraham had been following God for quite a while at this point. But Abraham was still in a land where the people all around him worshipped idols. And in those days, because the people did not know the science of weather, they believed that their gods were responsible for any droughts or plagues or famines or diseases that they experienced. The gods created it all, right? To try to appease these gods, the people would give sacrifices to keep them happy. If I give my God the best of what I have, the God will stay happy and there won't be a drought. And we'll all have a bountiful harvest and there won't be any disease. But in Canaan, they had many, many, many droughts and famines in the near past. Okay, this was something that the current generation remembered vividly, being hungry and there being no water. And they were desperate to keep the gods from sending more. And so they, in their desperation, they gave the greatest sacrifice that they could think to give: their children. Primal ideas that this would appease the gods the most, to give up what they loved the most. But Abraham's God wanted to make it clear to the people that this God, they were not like these idol gods that the other people worshipped. And I had always believed this, that the whole purpose behind the sacrifice of Isaac and the rescuing of Isaac was because God was making it a point that they were not like these other gods, that they did not want human sacrifice. But at the same time, I'm thinking that while that's all well and good, why was it necessary to traumatize the child to make this point? But as I said before, I'm so happy that there is always more to learn about God and about the context of the Bible. First of all, I have always believed that there is no way that God ever tests us, okay? God does not test any one of us, because we all live our lives the best we can, and we stumble because we're human, and we come against things that cause us discomfort and they cause us pain, because that is a part of our journey here on earth. And these things that we cannot control, such as famine and droughts, are not sent as punishment, and the stumbles that we take in navigating our paths are not the result of any test or temptation from God, but they are simply stumbles that we make because we are humans. Our Creator is not there to punish us and test us and punish us when we fail. Our Creator is there to stand with us and help us through these times. Can I hear an amen? Thank you. The first chapter of the book of James tells us that no one who is tested should say, God is tempting me. This is because God is not tempted by any form of evil, nor does he tempt anyone. Everyone is tempted by their own cravings that lures them away. Once they give in to these cravings, that is the birth of sin, and then that sin leads to the spiritual death, which we can always turn away from. And then James goes on to say, and here's where it gets good, every good gift, every perfect gift, and in my mind, every child, comes from above, and God chose to give us birth, chose to give us life. Our God, the God of Abraham, is a God of life, not death. And God would never ask for the death of any person as a payment for their grace. That's not how God works. Now, aside from that logic, I was relieved to find an entirely plausible explanation for this horrific passage, other than it was just pure fiction that a Hebrew author came up with in the spur of the moment. And that is that this entire passage, this entire story I actually read, was a vision that God gave to Abraham. It never actually happened. And there is support for this idea that it was a vision as opposed to an actual attempted filicide. And the first idea is that God told Abraham to go to the land of Moriah, which was actually the land of the Amorites. Okay? And the hill where the shrine or the altar that Abraham came to, that mountain is called the Mountain of the Amorites, and that is where the city of Jerusalem is built. Now, in Genesis 14, a couple of chapters before this supposed attempted sacrifice of Isaac, in Genesis 14, Lot, who was Abraham's nephew, had been kidnapped when 5 Mesopotamian kings ransacked the city of Sodom. After rescuing his nephew and defeating the kings, Abraham was there in the city of Jerusalem and the king of Salem. Now let me back up here for a second. The name Jerusalem, or Jerusalem, Salem comes from shalom, which is peace. Jerusalem is the city of peace. I see Ed Grennan back there. He knows where I'm going with this. Jerusalem, city of peace. The king of Salem, the king of the city of peace. Melchizedek brought Abraham bread and wine and blessed him after he defeated these Mesopotamian kings. And then Abraham gives him a tithe. He recognized him as a high priest of God. Like other Semitic tribes at the time, the Amorites worshiped the God of heaven, just like Abraham and his tribe. The same living God to which Abraham went to sacrifice on this high place, at this altar, on the Mount of the Amorites in the city of Jerusalem. Now, had Abraham and his son Isaac and his servants actually traveled to Jerusalem, then the custom would have demanded that the king go out and meet Abraham. And the king and the noblemen of Jerusalem, or Salem at the time, would have gathered around the altar for such a sacrifice, but there is no mention of this anywhere. Nor is there any mention of Sarah, Abraham's wife, or any objection from her. Can you imagine a husband taking their only child, the only child of a mom, and her having no objection to it? No. No. And there's no mention of her either. There's no mention of Sarah. There's no mention of Melchizedek. And all of this points to a vision or a dream that Abraham had. And God was telling him in this vision that if Abraham did feel the need to sacrifice, that a sheep or a ram or a goat would suffice. Abraham would have related this vision to others, and the Hebrews would have followed suit. God wanted to make sure that their people knew that there was never a sacrifice that was going to be needed to pay for their grace. I am so thankful for this explanation because as far-fetched as a lot of the stories in the Bible are, and there are some weird stories in the Bible, y'all, I could never wrap my head around God ever expecting such a sacrifice from a parent. Because God does not take the gifts away that they give to us. God gives us gifts and expects us to be stewards of these gifts. God gave us the earth, and they expect us to be stewards of the earth. If God gives us children, they expect us to be stewards of those children, to raise them and to guide them in the way that God would have them go. And children are undoubtedly the most precious gift to ever be given by God. I might be a little biased being a parent myself, but I thank God for the gifts and the guidance that they provided to Abraham. I thank God for the vision that they gave to Abraham. The undoubted truth that God is a God of life, that God is a God of love, and would never wish the death upon any of their children. And I am thankful that God's work continues for us today. Great is God's faithfulness. God will provide always. Amen.